How do you forge an identity when the system designed to define you has already declared you worthless? Maki Zenin's transformation from rejected clan member to one of Jujutsu Kaisen's most formidable sorcerers isn't a simple underdog story. It's a psychological case study in what happens when an individual refuses to internalize the toxic narratives imposed by family systems, demonstrating what trauma researchers call adversarial growth, the paradoxical strengthening that can emerge from extreme psychological adversity. Her story reveals uncomfortable truths about how families can become prisons, how assigned identities can be dismantled and rebuilt, and why breaking free from generational toxicity requires psychological mechanisms most people never develop. Today we're examining the architecture of Maki's rebellion, the clinical frameworks that explain her resilience, and why her journey resonates with anyone who's ever had to choose between belonging and becoming themselves. Start with the family system itself, because Maki's psychology cannot be understood outside the context that shaped it. The Zenin clan operates as what family systems therapist Murray Bowen termed an undifferentiated ego mass, a psychological structure where individual worth is entirely subsumed by conformity to collective values. In the Zenin framework, cursed energy potential determines not just status, but ontological validity. Members who cannot produce significant cursed energy aren't merely considered weak or disappointing. They're treated as existential errors, non-persons within the family narrative. This creates what trauma specialist Judith Herman identifies as complex trauma, repeated psychological injury within a captive situation where escape appears impossible. Maki experienced this from birth. Born with virtually no cursed energy, she was labeled defective before she could demonstrate any other qualities, before she could establish an identity independent of this single metric. The psychological impact of this ontological rejection, this message that your existence itself violates core family values, typically produces either complete psychological collapse or the kind of defensive rigidity that prevents authentic development. Yet Maki developed neither. This is where her psychology becomes clinically fascinating. Developmental psychologists studying non-shared environment effects have documented how siblings raised in identical households can develop radically different psychological profiles based on differential treatment within that system. Maki and her twin sister Mai received vastly different messages from the Zenin clan despite nearly identical genetics. Mai possessed marginal cursed energy, earning her conditional acceptance that created psychological dependence on the family system. She developed what's clinically recognizable as dependent personality features, excessive need for approval, difficulty making autonomous decisions, intense fear of separation from the family despite its toxicity. Maki, receiving zero positive reinforcement from the clan, had nothing to lose by psychological and physical exit. This paradoxically freed her in ways that Mai's conditional acceptance never could. Psychologist Barry Schwartz identified this as the paradox of choice. Sometimes having fewer options liberates us from decision paralysis and ambivalence. Maki's complete rejection eliminated ambivalence entirely, clarifying that her only viable path was complete reconstruction outside the family system. The psychological mechanism enabling this reconstruction centers on what Carl Rogers called internal locus of evaluation, the capacity to judge your worth by your own standards rather than others' opinions. Most children internalize their caregivers' evaluations, developing what Rogers termed conditions of worth, the belief that you're valuable only when meeting specific external standards. Maki somehow avoided this internalization despite years of familial rejection. This suggests she either possessed what resilience researchers call constitutional resilience, innate temperamental qualities buffering against environmental toxicity, or she had access to alternative attachment figures who provided the psychological foundation her biological family denied. Regardless of origin, this internal locus of evaluation allowed her to maintain stable self-concept despite external invalidation. When her family declared her worthless, she evaluated that claim against her own emerging sense of capability and found the family's assessment faulty rather than accepting it as truth. Alfred Adler's framework of inferiority and compensation illuminates what happened next. Adler proposed that perceived inferiorities drive compensatory striving for superiority in related domains. Maki experienced what Adler would classify as an inferiority complex, but rather than internalizing assigned inferiority as identity, she developed aggressive compensation through alternative achievement pathways. This isn't simple stubbornness or determination. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism, transforming potential learned helplessness into what positive psychologists now term adversarial growth. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness demonstrates that organisms repeatedly exposed to inescapable negative outcomes eventually stop attempting to escape, even when escape becomes possible. Maki never developed this pattern. Instead, she maintained what psychologists call an internal locus of control, the belief that her actions could influence outcomes despite overwhelming environmental evidence suggesting otherwise. This psychological orientation, maintaining agency belief despite systemic invalidation, represents extraordinary ego strength. From Jungian perspectives, Maki embodies the wounded warrior archetype who must reject the collective unconscious of her family system to individuate. Jung believed true psychological maturity requires separating from values and expectations imposed by origin communities, a process he termed individuation. For most people, this occurs gradually through adolescence and young adulthood. For Maki, it required dramatic rupture. Her departure from the Zenin clan represents what psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the use of an object, a developmental stage where we psychologically destroy dependence on parental figures to establish autonomous selfhood. This wasn't impulsive acting out. It was what psychiatrist Irvin Yalom would recognize as existential crisis, a confrontation with fundamental questions about meaning, identity, and authentic existence. She chose what existential philosophers term being for itself over being in itself, actively creating identity rather than passively accepting assigned roles. The physical manifestation of her rebellion, relying entirely on weapons and physical prowess rather than cursed energy, functions as what Freud termed sublimation, channeling unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable achievement. Her rage at familial rejection doesn't explode into destructive acting out. It transforms into disciplined martial excellence. This represents mature defense mechanisms, the highest level in George Vaillant's hierarchy of psychological adaptations. Where immature defenses like denial or projection fragment psychological coherence, sublimation allows Maki to acknowledge anger while directing it toward constructive goals. She's neither repressing her fury nor acting it out destructively. She's integrating it into a functional identity that uses rage as fuel rather than allowing it to become consuming fire. Her capacity to form healthy attachments despite familial rejection reveals crucial information about her psychological development. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, demonstrates that early relationships create internal working models shaping all future connections. Victims of consistent familial rejection typically develop disorganized attachment, characterized by contradictory behaviors and unstable self-concept. Yet Maki demonstrates remarkably secure attachment patterns with chosen family members like Panda and Inumaki. This suggests she internalized what object relations theorists call good objects, positive representations of caregivers, despite her biological family's failure. Somewhere in her development, possibly through early interactions or alternative attachment figures, she introjected a sense of her own worth that the Zenin clan couldn't destroy. This internal good object serves as what Bowlby called a secure base, allowing her to explore challenging environments because she carries psychological safety within her rather than needing to seek it externally. What distinguishes Maki's response from typical trauma reactions? She demonstrates what trauma researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun identified as post-traumatic growth, the paradoxical phenomenon where individuals emerge from severe adversity with enhanced rather than diminished functioning. Tedeschi and Calhoun identified 5 domains of post-traumatic growth: greater appreciation for life, warmer relationships, increased personal strength, recognition of new possibilities, and spiritual development. Maki demonstrates virtually all these markers. Her near-death experiences heighten her sense of vitality and purpose, rather than creating avoidance behaviors. Her bonds with fellow outcasts run deeper than typical friendships because they're based on chosen affinity rather than obligation. She recognizes her strength as self-created rather than inherited, fundamentally altering her relationship with achievement. She opens pathways for others rejected by Jujutsu society, transforming her suffering into advocacy. While not spiritual in conventional terms, she develops what Viktor Frankl called tragic optimism, finding meaning despite, and perhaps because of, unavoidable suffering. The psychological toll of her journey requires acknowledgement here, because romanticizing her resilience without acknowledging its costs misrepresents trauma's impact. Spoiler warning for manga readers. After Mai's death and Maki's subsequent transformation into someone with zero cursed energy and heavenly restriction similar to Toji Fushiguro, we witness what Jung termed the union of opposites. Her complete rejection by the family system paradoxically grants ultimate freedom and power. She becomes what the clan feared most, proof that their value system is arbitrary, that meaning can be created outside their rigid hierarchy. From narrative psychology perspectives, she's rewritten her life story from defective family member to transcendent force beyond conventional limitations. This cognitive reframing is precisely what trauma therapists facilitate, helping clients transform trauma narratives from victimization stories to stories of survival and agency. But her massacre of the Zenin clan represents what Freud called the return of the repressed, years of suppressed rage finally expressing itself. While narratively satisfying, from clinical perspectives this indicates unresolved trauma requiring processing. Real psychological healing rarely involves violent catharsis. It typically requires what Bessel van der Kolk calls befriending the body, integrating traumatic memories through gradual exposure and emotional regulation. Maki's journey involves what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified as grief stages, denial through anger to eventual acceptance, not just for Mai's death, but for the family she never had. Her transformation involves both growth and loss, both liberation and grief. Acknowledging this complexity prevents reducing her story to simple triumph narrative when the reality encompasses both empowerment and profound psychological cost. Why does Maki resonate so powerfully with audiences? She represents what psychologist James Marshall termed identity achievement, the most mature identity status where individuals explore alternatives to inherited roles and commit to self-chosen values. Many viewers, especially those from collectivist cultures or rigid family systems, see their own psychological struggles reflected in her journey. She validates the experience of those who feel invisible in their families, those whose worth depends on meeting arbitrary standards, those who must choose between authenticity and belonging. Social comparison theory suggests we're drawn to characters modeling solutions to our psychological dilemmas, and Maki demonstrates that self-worth can survive even total familial rejection. She proves that families don't determine destinies, they provide context, but individuals possess agency in constructing meaning from their circumstances. Her character also challenges what psychologists call entity theory, the belief that abilities are fixed traits. The Zenin clan operates entirely on entity theory. You either have cursed energy or you don't, permanently determining your value. Maki embodies incremental theory, the belief that abilities develop through effort and strategy. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset versus fixed mindset applies directly here. Maki's existence disproves her family's fixed mindset ideology, demonstrating that dedication and discipline can overcome supposed genetic destiny. This isn't motivational platitude. It's supported by neuroscience research showing how practice literally rewires neural pathways, creating abilities that didn't exist innately. Her physical prowess wasn't inherited. It was constructed through thousands of hours of deliberate practice, exactly as skill acquisition research predicts. From social psychological perspectives, Maki engaged in what researchers call individual mobility, psychologically exiting the group and seeking new bases for identity. Social identity theory suggests we derive self-worth from group membership, and losing that membership should devastate self-concept. Yet Maki never fully identified with the Zenin clan despite biological membership, suggesting she recognized early that their values were toxic rather than aspirational. This cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between external evaluation and internal self-concept, typically forces resolution through either changing beliefs or changing environment. Most individuals cannot sustain this tension long-term. Maki not only sustained it, but weaponized it, using her family's rejection as motivational fuel rather than allowing it to become internalized shame. The broader implications of Maki's psychology extend beyond anime analysis into understanding how toxic systems shape and damage human development. Her story illustrates what Murray Bowen called differentiation of self, the capacity to maintain individual identity within relationship systems without being overwhelmed by others' expectations. Many people struggle with this balance, either becoming enmeshed in family systems that stifle individuality or cutting off completely in ways that leave unresolved psychological wounds. Maki initially attempts complete cutoff, but her ultimate psychological maturity involves integrating her past without being controlled by it, acknowledging her origins while refusing to let them define her limitations. This represents healthy differentiation rather than reactive cutoff. She also demonstrates what positive psychologists call benefit finding, the ability to extract meaning and growth from adversity. This isn't toxic positivity or denial of suffering. It's the sophisticated psychological skill of holding both the reality of pain and the possibility of growth simultaneously. Maki doesn't pretend her family's rejection didn't hurt. She also doesn't let that pain become her entire identity. This psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt perspective based on context, is one of the strongest predictors of mental health according to contemporary research. She can acknowledge her wounds while refusing to be defined by them, can honor her pain while choosing not to be imprisoned by it. Ultimately, Maki Zenin's psychology teaches us that assigned identities aren't destinies. Her journey validates the painful truth that sometimes the healthiest response to toxic systems is exit and reconstruction rather than endless reconciliation attempts. She proves that worth isn't inherited or assigned, but created through choices and commitments. Her resilience isn't superhuman. It's the natural human capacity for growth when psychological resources like determination, support from chosen family, and clear values align with opportunity. She demonstrates that the systems that reject us don't have final authority over our worth unless we grant them that authority. She chose not to grant it, and that choice, repeated daily through action and commitment, became the foundation of an identity far more robust than anything her family could have provided. As you reflect on Maki's psychological journey, consider how these dynamics might operate in your own life. Where have you internalized external evaluations that don't serve you? What toxic systems might require psychological separation? How can you cultivate the internal security that withstands external invalidation? If this analysis resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological examinations of your favorite characters. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on Maki's development and what psychological aspects we should explore next. Remember, understanding fictional psychology helps us understand ourselves, and that's where real transformation begins.